don't have any errors in the output. And we can click here to see it. We can see that a zip file has been created, which is now ready to upload into the PBX and be ready for use. To add this to the PBX, all we need to do is go to the advanced menu under CallFlow apps.
Tô jogando só porque é no tumulto aqui fazer a missão, depois eu vou sair.
We select our zip file that we have created, are ready for use, to be deployed in the PBX. When the relevant options which transfers to the enable.
O negócio da luva de pedreiro é por aqui, não é?
Click on add, enable, browse, select the prompt.
Eu acho que não tem luva nesse modo não, velho.
Ok.
Ah, tem. Talvez não tenha. Luva de pedreiro online.
Welcome back to the second CallFlow design course. One step further now. Main project, we obtain the relevant condition. I will set up the office hour section. Select the inform the prompt, add.
Vamos ver se reseta. Vamos tirar a prova, né?
Select voice.
A prova cabal.
And type the message.
Ai, peguei.
And this is followed by the component to disconnect.
Tá bom. Ih, reseta, fudeu, é isso.
So what remains now is to build the project
Agora vai.
and go and upload it to the PBX. Just like we did in the first video, let's go and add that call flow and add that to our inbound rules. Now all that's left is to test it.
É, tem que deixar uma carga, né? Senão acaba já era. Fodeu.
Press 2. We will press 2.
Please leave the message after tone and then press any button.
Hello, this is a test message. Thank you.
Your message has been received. Thank you.
De reconstrução das torres está todo vapor. Relaxe nessas férias com mão esquenta. Campanha na praia. Um oferecimento da seguradora não esquenta. Praia não inclusa, relaxamento não incluso, diversão não inclusa. Confira os termos de serviço para mais detalhes.
CallFlow designer video. Hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to seeing you in the third one. See you later.
Os automáticos na mão do Jubinha viram uma instante kill.
Hello and welcome to our third CallFlow designer video tutorial. In this video, we will use our project from the second video and expand it to use components. These components are something like an independent CallFlow, grouping existing CallFlow items within a CallFlow. And we can also reuse these components multiple times in our main CallFlow. This will make it easier to configure our project by reusing these different components multiple times without needing to reconfigure them over and over again. We will also introduce the identification of a user by asking the caller to enter a 4-digit support ID. We won't actually authenticate the caller in this video, that's for the fourth video, but we will read the caller ID the caller enters back to them before forwarding them to the support queue. One of our components will be reused multiple times in this tutorial. So let's go back to our second project that we created. Let's create a component for the sales option. In the Project Explorer on the top right hand side, right click the project and select new component.
Graças a Deus esse câncer a gente não passa mais, né? Graças a Deus.
Let's name it sales option. Double-clicking on this new component will show you a blank call flow, just like we saw at the beginning of our first project. So I'm going to go and transfer the sales office hours call flow into the sales options component.
Como eu chegar para comprar o clube, quando você compra o clube ele fica ativo durante 30 dias, por exemplo. Se comprar o clube no dia 5, ele vai ficar no dia 5 desse mês até o dia 5 do mês que vem. Tá ligado? As skins sempre chegam no dia 31.
But this will leave the sales option empty in our main call flow, right?
22.
Not to worry, this is easily fixed. In our list of call flow components on the left-hand menu, you will notice our new sales option component is listed under the user-defined component right down the bottom. All I need to do is drag the sales option component to the main sales flow, our option number 2 if you remember. We might just be seeing only one building block here, but double clicking on it reveals the more complex flow we've had with them. As you may have already noticed, on the top of the screen now we can see the main call flow and the sales option component are now in tab form. This allows the transition between the different independent call flows in a very easy fashion. I will now create a new component for the support queue. In this component now, I will create an authentication component. From the call control section, I will move the authentication component to our call flow. Double clicking on this component, I will now configure the necessary authentication parameters. We will ask for the user ID only, not a PIN in this case. The prompts required for the authentication will also be created as text to speech, just like we did in the second video.
Cancelar o clube, nada retirado pra você cancelar, velho. Fortnite nunca tira nada de ninguém, velho.
I will also modify the number of acceptable digits to be 4. And the stop digit will be set to none, so after the 4 digits are entered, it will automatically be accepted. When the valid support ID has been entered, the valid input condition will be met, and the call will be processed according to this condition. I will put a prompt playback component into the call flow and name it ID verification. Let's edit this to say, the support ID you have entered is, followed by the support ID. The first prompt will be in quotation marks to read out the text. The second prompt will be the value of the ID entered. The function key will be used in this case to get the value of the authentication ID that has been entered. By clicking the function key, the expression editor is open, or we can go and extract the value of a variable. Click the Variables tab. We can see the authentication elements. We will need to have the authentication ID read out. So all I need to do is drag the ID element to the expression builder. Clicking on OK, we can now see that the authentication ID will be the prompt which is read out, and this is without quotation marks. I will now move the existing call flow components of the support queue into the new support option component.
Constrói, nem lembro, não precisa construir, mano. Foda-se. Construir pra quê, né? É só atirar aqui, ó. Resolve o problema.
Now, if someone enters an invalid support ID 3 times, the call will be forwarded to the sales queue, according to the sales option component. So I will bring that component into use. The components I created earlier allow me to reuse the mini call flows multiple times. All I need to do is drag the sales option component from the user-defined components in our left-hand menu to the invalid input. Now going back to our main call flow page, we will drag the support option component to option number 1. This will activate our mini call flow when the caller presses option number 1.
Ai, meu Deus.
So let's now go and test our new support option component. I will enter a random 4-digit support ID for now, and this will transfer our call to the support queue. But before I do, I will go and build the project.
Caralho, é
Going to the PBX, I
50.
will import that call
A
flow.
próxima deve ser 100, pô. Caralho, tá maluco. A próxima deve ser 100, pô. Tá maluco. A próxima
And
deve ser
going
100,
to
pô.
my inbound rules, I will modify my inbound rule to reflect the new CFD. Let's go and test that call now.
Próxima 70.
Welcome to our call.
Velho.
Press
Tô
1.
jogando essa merda, pô. Porra. Vou até dar uma mijada depois.
We'll press 1.
Please enter your 4-digit support ID.
Okay, I will enter a 4-digit ID.
The support ID you have entered is 1234.
Your call will now be transferred to technical support. So it reads back my support ID and forwards the call to technical support. And just like that, we have made the call through the CFD to enter our support ID. It reads it back and forwards the call. I hope you enjoyed our third installment of the CFD video tutorial. Thank you very much for your attention. See you again. Welcome to the fourth installment of our short CFD video tutorials. In this video, we will take our project, our simple project, and give it a lot more intelligence. We will go and verify if the support ID a caller has entered is actually valid or not. We will work on the support option component in this video, where the support ID a caller enters will be verified against the database. If it is valid, the caller will be welcomed and the call forwarded to the support queue. If the support ID entered is invalid, the call will be forwarded to the sales option call flow component. Opening the support option component, we will see the call flow we created in our third video. We will enhance the valid input call flow to verify the support ID which has been entered. This will read out the support ID entered, then contact the database the support IDs are stored in to verify if it is a valid option. Let's go and configure that now. Underneath the ID verification prompt, I will drag a database access component from the application tools section. I will rename it to support ID lookup. Double click to configure it. Now let's configure the database details that the CFD will connect to and obtain the support ID. I'm using a PostgreSQL server, so I will select that as the database type. Now we will enter the individual properties of the database. First we will enter the database server IP. The database name is company. The username to connect to the database is Postgres. And then the password. The statement type will be set to scalar to return a single value. In this case, the number of database entries the support ID entered matches. Before we write the SQL statement which will go and retrieve the value of the support ID entered from the database, we will define the parameter we will use. I will use ID as the name of the parameter. Pressing the 3-dot button next to the value field opens the expression editor, just like we saw from the third video, with the reading out of the entered ID. We will get the ID parameter, which is the support ID entered by the user. Now we will go and create the SQL statement to see if a database entry exists with the support ID. Select count and the star. Returns the number of database entries that match the search criteria. Then we add from customers to query the customers table. And finally using where the ID parameter is. So what is the ID parameter? I will now use a placeholder to get the value of the parameter below and put it into the SQL statement. We will receive a response from the database. Now, we will need to establish a condition which will define what will happen when a match is found in the database and what will happen when no matches are found. We will receive a response from the database. We will need to establish a condition which will define what will happen when the response from the database is valid or invalid. I must mention that we already have two call flows in this component for valid and invalid input. That input is whether a caller has entered a 4-digit ID. The condition that we will create now is to check that the 4-digit ID is actually a valid ID which is present in the system. From the call flow section, I will drag the create a condition component to just underneath the database access component. This will be called ID validity. The first condition is a valid ID entry. I will rename the first condition valid ID. Let's configure the condition to be met so this is considered a valid ID, meaning that this ID is in the database. This is done by double-clicking the valid ID condition. The function button will be used to create the condition. Assuming each support ID is unique in our database, we want the response of the database query to be 1, meaning that the ID which was entered is present. So from our previous SQL statement, we should receive a response of 1, since we used the select count statement. I will go to the inbuilt functions and select the Boolean function of equal and drag it to my expression builder. This compares if the two values provided are equal to each other. Next, going to the Variables tab, I will select my support ID lookup scalar result and also drag this to the expression builder. A valid ID in the database would return a scalar result of 1. So this will be entered as a constant variable, which is an integer number of 1.
Sumiu todo mundo do jogo. O modo que era pra ser rápido é lento. Impressionante.
We will make this even more interesting to the caller now by also returning and reading out the name of the caller as well, which corresponds to the support ID. Adding another database access component to look up the name of the user based on the support ID entered will be required. Let's drag that component to the valid ID condition. I will rename it to user's name lookup. Again, the database configuration will be required. This time the statement type will be set to query to return a row from the database using the selected statement. In the parameters we will enter the value of the ID to be the authentication ID entered, just like we did earlier. I will just write it down now. Now let's add the statement to select the name from the row of the customer's table based on the ID. Again, the placeholder will be used to get the value of the authentication ID entered. As we now have the value of the name, we will read it back to the caller. I will move the existing call flow components which we previously had to transfer the call to support to the new condition call flow. I will edit the prompt for the transferring of the call to support to now also read back the name of the caller. The old prompt which we had pre-recorded way back in the first video will now be scrapped and replaced with a text-to-speech prompt which says welcome. I will add a second prompt now which will return the value of the name assigned to the user ID and read it out.